For decades, we've been promised this future of flying cars zipping between buildings. Well, believe it or not, that future is getting really, really close. But as the tech gets ready for takeoff, the real question isn't can we build them, it's will we actually use them? It turns out the biggest obstacle might not be the technology, but what's going on inside our own heads.
So, let me just ask you straight up. If an autonomous electric flying taxi was ready and waiting for you tomorrow, would you get in? Seriously, think about it for a second. It sounds like a simple yes or no, right? But that gut reaction you're having is the result of a super complex mental calculation that we're about to break down.
And this is basically a map of that very decision. It's called the Urban Air Mobility Adoption Behavior Tree. I know, it looks a little complicated, but this diagram is going to be our guide for this whole explainer. It pretty much holds the secrets to whether flying taxis become a part of our daily lives or just a cool idea that never took off. Okay, so let's jump right in. To really get the big picture, we've got to start at the very core of this model. This is all about the fundamental psychology of how you and I decide whether to adopt or just totally reject any new piece of tech. So, right at the heart of this entire diagram, you see these three blue boxes. This is the engine room of your choice. It comes down to your personal attitude, the influence of what are called subjective norms, and your feeling of perceived behavioral control. These are the three big calculations we're all making, whether we realize it or not. And this isn't just some random idea. It's based on a classic concept in psychology called the theory of planned behavior. Sounds fancy, but it's actually super simple. It basically says our intention to do something boils down to three key questions. First, your attitude. Do I even want to do this? Second, social pressure. What are other people going to think? And third, perceived control. Do I actually feel like I can do this?
All right, so now let's build on that foundation. Because that core decision, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's being constantly influenced by a whole bunch of external factors that are either pulling us towards the idea of a flying taxi or pushing us away from it.
So, let's start with the pulls. These are all the green boxes you see on our map, the things that make this whole idea sound awesome. We're talking about the exciting stuff, from the obvious, like saving a ton of time, to the deeper things, like whether we actually trust the system to work. So think of these as all the reasons you'd say yes. The perceived benefits are huge. I mean, imagine just skipping rush hour traffic entirely. Then you've got things like peer influence and social legitimacy. If all your friends are doing it, it starts to seem normal, right? And of course, the practical stuff, like whether there are landing pads nearby and even environmental concerns, all push us to give it a try. But for every one of those pulls, there's a really powerful push in the other direction. These are the red boxes on our diagram, the barriers. And let's be honest, there are two huge ones that probably popped into your head right away. How much is this going to cost me? And is it actually safe? And really, this is the trade-off it all boils down to. On one side of the scale, you have these incredible benefits. The convenience, the time you'd save, the pure coolness factor of it. But on the other side, you've got some very real perceived risks. And it's not just about physical safety, but also things like cybersecurity and whether the service will just be reliable. For you, me, for anyone, the decision hangs on which side of that scale feels heavier. Okay, so we've got the psychology down, but what does this model actually predict for the future? Well, this is where we get to connect all that theory to some real hard numbers. So, based on this model, if we look at the general population right now, the baseline behavioral intention is just over 16%. To put it simply, that means only about 1 out of every 6 people is even willing to consider using a flying taxi service. That's our starting point.
But here's where it gets wild. Being willing to consider something is very different from actually doing it. When the model projects how many people will actually use one by 2026, that number plummets to just 4.1%. That huge gap between 16% and 4%, that's all those barriers we just talked about, the cost, the lack of infrastructure, and those big lingering safety questions.
But hang on, the story is not over, because the data shows a really fascinating split. There is one specific group of people that is way, way more excited about this future than everyone else. Get this. Among young people, that initial willingness isn't 16%, it's over 28%. That's a massive difference. We're talking about a major generational gap in how we see this kind of game-changing technology. And this chart just makes that divide crystal clear. Just look at the difference in willingness between the general population and the youth. It's pretty obvious that while older generations might be a bit skeptical, the next generation seems far more ready to embrace the skies. The future of this whole industry might literally depend on them.
So, the real takeaway here is this. Building a safe, working flying taxi is only half the challenge. The other half, and you could argue it's the harder half, is getting over these huge social and psychological hurdles. It's all about winning our trust and convincing us as a society to take that leap. Which brings us right back to the heart of it. As you think about this future, what do you think is the single biggest mountain we have to climb? Is it making it affordable for everyone? Is it proving it's 100% safe? Or is it that much trickier human element of just earning our collective trust? The answer to that is probably going to decide just how soon we'll all be looking up to hail a ride.